Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we look back at the legacy of the late great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, with the help of Gil Troy, a professor of history at McGill University and the author of this book, Moynihan's Moment, America's Fight Against Zionism as Racism. Also, a very special guest joins us today. Maura Moynihan is the daughter of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and we want to welcome both of you to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Let me dive right into the subject matter. The event that Moynihan's Moment revolves around, the UN Resolution 3379. Tell us what it was and why it passed back in November of 1975.
On November 1975, there was a Soviet-Arab plot to try to humiliate the United States by picking on the United States ally, Israel, and picking one form of nationalism in a form of nationalisms, Jewish nationalism, Zionism, and saying that was racist. And of course, by the 1970s, racism was the worst appellation you could give to a national movement, and it worked. And you had one individual, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was representing the United States in the UN, who said, this is not acceptable. And he worked with Chaim Herzog, the Israeli ambassador, and what I call Moynihan's Moment is actually two moments. One is the power of Moynihan's courage in standing up and saying, this shall not pass, although it did. And the second was the tremendous American response, where Americans from left to right, white, black, Jews and non-Jews, stood up and applauded and said, finally, in the wake of the Vietnam crisis, in the wake of Watergate, we have a hero who's standing up and speaking proud for America.
Sort of regaining some confidence, some national
Absolutely.
confidence.
And I think it anticipated Reagan's Morning in America in the 1980s. We see in the 1970s that ultimately what emerges is the patriotic resurgence.
When did you decide that this was an event worthy of a book?
Well, I think what triggered it for me as an American historian was thinking about the fall of South Vietnam. April 1975 is such a low moment in American history. And then to see that 6 months later, there's this moment in the UN where one guy gets up and says, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. And a year later, in fact, that was the theme of the movie Network, which I think was inspired by Moynihan's Moment. So all of a sudden, I'm starting to see, I'd written a book about Reagan in the 1980s, that in the 1970s, things are shifting, and it's not just this decade of despair, it's not just this decade of humiliation, it's also a decade where there are moments where American leaders are saying, we've had enough.
Maura, I'm going to make a guess that when you have a father who is such a prominent public figure as your dad was, that it's hard to separate the personal remembrance from the public remembrance, and the two start to run together.
Well, of course, you're absolutely right, and but the personal is the one that I remember and cherish the most. And I want to commend Professor Troy for writing this book, because I thought it really was Dad's finest hour in a long and distinguished career. He, stood up against a totalitarian move to politicize the United Nations and to demonize the state of Israel and to attack democracy. And in doing so, he also exposed a Nazi, Kurt Waldheim, who was then Secretary General of the United Nations, who 10 years later it was revealed had been a Nazi and oversaw the extermination of many European Jews, and the photographs came out. And so I remember, he was just a man on fire in these years. And I just remember the family dinners and coming back, and just he just seemed possessed and sort of took, and it was interesting to me, I'd forgotten until Gil had written this wonderful book, that he'd never even been to Israel.
Huh. So at the time, did you have any sense of how significant a moment? Because you just said now, a pretty amazing statement, that of all the things that your dad was involved in and accomplished, this is the one that you think is his finest moment. At what point did that become evident to you?
Oh, it was evident from the beginning when the Zionism is Racism resolution was first tabled, and because my parents' friends, of course, had many of them were Holocaust survivors, or their parents had been Holocaust survivors, and we grew up in New York, and many of our friends were Jewish intellectuals, and so the Holocaust was still very present in people's lives and memories, and so the idea of the big red lie, and which was what Dad had labeled, the big lie was what Hitler had promoted, the idea of it coming back in this august body that was created after the defeat of the Nazis was so shocking and so offensive, and also the idea that the American State Department wasn't really keen to do much about it. And so he kind of took matters into his own hands, as Gill so deftly reveals in the book. And of course, this was the age before the cell phone and email. And one way he was able to get around meeting Idi Amin, for example, he would have been instructed to have met the Ugandan dictator, was his aide, Susie Weaver, said the fax machine wasn't working. Sorry, didn't get your message in time.
If only now we're constantly
Right,
wired.
you can't get away with that.
We can't. But unpopular in Washington, but popular with the American public.
Yeah, although at first he wasn't aware of that, because he lived in this universe of the New York Times, first of all, and the New York Times is saying, don't be so confrontational, you got to be diplomatic. He's worried about his Harvard colleagues, because he's a Harvard professor who's now temporarily dispatched to the UN. And the State Department people are all undermining him. Henry Kissinger, the first Jewish Secretary of State, is on the day that Moynihan's giving this big speech, November 10th, 1975, saying to one of his aides, we're conducting foreign policy here, this isn't a synagogue. And they then joke about whether Moynihan, this Irish Catholic guy, wants to convert to Judaism. So in the universe that he's concerned with, he's feeling very alone. And then when he gives this amazing speech, and he speaks so eloquently, and the American people respond, he realizes, he's now created a moment. And it's November 11th, 1975, really, which is Moynihan's moment with the American people, where 125,000 people mass in Midtown Manhattan, black and white, left and right, saying, we're not going to accept this, we're not going to be that kind of nation that succumbs to this kind of false diplomacy, and we're going to understand that we've got to stand for principles. And then 26,000 letters come cascading into the U.S. mission to the UN, and Moynihan becomes Moynihan.
And he ultimately loses this job, the UN job, but it sets the table for his next job, the U.S. Senate seat.
Right. He talked himself out of the job. He only lasts as U.S. ambassador to the UN for 8 months. It's a very historic turning point. It's a very full 8 months, but it's only 8 months. And it's 3 months after the Zionism Racism Resolution fight that Kissinger ultimately succeeds in pulling the carpet out from under him and making his position there untenable. But indeed, and we should emphasize that Moynihan went into the job rather unpopular. He'd been involved in 2 controversies that were racially tinged, where he was falsely accused of being racist when he was actually trying to raise issues about the black family and raise issues about how to make sure the civil rights movement evolves. So he's an unpopular guy politically, and because of this stand, because of this heroism, he ends up running in 1976 for the U.S. Senate and serves 4 very glorious careers, for very glorious terms.
Did he worry about his popularity, or you talked about a man on fire, or did it just fuel his fire if he was involved in something that was deemed controversial?
Well, he was a very sensitive soul, and of course he did care very deeply what people felt about his work.
But not enough to adjust his opinion.
Well, you know, he was really a seeker of truth. And that's what the Moynihan Report was about, and that's what Moynihan's Moment was about. And he had little tolerance for people who were false or lied, especially about issues of such import as anti-Semitism, as racism, as poverty. And the support of the American people at that time really meant a lot to him when he was getting pushback from certain people in the State Department or certain journalists. I remember how he would talk about how the letters that came from all over the country, from all over the world, in support of how he stood up against the Zionism is racism resolution.
But you sensed his anguish in
Absolutely.
the letters. You see it. I mean, he's worried, but he does it because it's the right thing to do, and that's part of the heroism, and it's a heroism we need today.
And who were there other courageous political allies? Who stood with him?
Well, first of all, Chaim Herzog, who was the Israeli ambassador to the UN. And we should emphasize that back in Jerusalem, like back in Washington, there wasn't always support because the Israeli Foreign Ministry is seeing a much more complicated picture with Egypt in the process of becoming more of an American ally, and they think that'll be helpful for the peace process. So they're saying, it's just words don't matter. But Herzog and Moynihan say, no, words count. And we've got to take these words, this big lie, very seriously. So that's one key ally. In the UN, among the American staff, there's Len Garment, who is the U.S. ambassador to the Human Rights Committee, and he is the one who calls the resolution obscene. He's a trial lawyer, and he wants to find the right word to show what is this. And he says obscene because obscenity sullies us all, not just the person who's created this crazy idea. He has his more mentioned Susie Weaver, who will become Susie Garment, who's crucial as an aide speechwriter. And there's also a lovely story that on the day that he gives the speech, November 10th, 1975, feeling very alone, he looks out into the well of the UN, and there, having flown up from Washington, is Hubert Humphrey, one of the great liberals who was there to just give support and to show that it was a heroic moment. And it's a nice linkage to the true liberalism. And we should emphasize that Moynihan's fighting for the soul of liberalism like he's fighting for the soul of the United States of America, because he fears that there's a hard left, a totalitarian left, that's undermining what liberalism is all about.
You mentioned Susie Garment, and there's a story you tell in the book about the Idi Amin moment where Susie Garment says that was the moment when Moynihan took control of his public life.
Yeah.
Could you give us the backstory there and what she meant by that?
Right, so the Zionism is Racism resolution is November, this is October 1975, this is a month before. And Idi Amin was already well known as this dictator who was well on his way to killing over 300,000 of his own people for his own racist reasons. And he is, through rotation, leading the Organization for African Unity, OAU, and he comes to the UN. And of course, it being a place for diplomacy, Kurt Waldheim, who's the Secretary General, and the entire UN diplomatic delegation welcomes him. And Moynihan doesn't want to welcome him. And so he refuses to go to the Waldheim dinner held for Amin. And then the next day he gives a speech in which, quoting the New York Times, he refers to Idi Amin as a racist murderer. And that triggers a major backlash. And Clarence Mitchell, who was an NAACP civil rights activist who was also working with Moynihan at the time, and Moynihan say, what is this? How could it be that people are angrier at Moynihan for being undiplomatic than at Idi Amin for being a murderer? And that's, as Susie said, when he took control of his
style over substance.
Right, and he said, it's crazy. We're living in a lunatic's asylum.
Yeah, the whole language matters and words matter. Mm-hmm. Was this something he talked about at home? Was he both a student and a teacher of the importance of language? That was something he tried to tell his family about?
Oh, of course. And in our home, there was no person or there was no profession, there was no calling greater than being a poet. And he would always quote the great Irish poets and Yeats and O'Casey, and you know, he wrote 18 books, and he wrote all his own speeches, and he produced many, many articles, and every day he wrote. And he always said that first and foremost he was a writer. And of all the other things he did, it all came from being a writer. And I think he always saw himself as a professor and a teacher, particularly in the Senate years. But in Moynihan's Moment, there's wonderful speeches that Gil has reminded the world about, that words matter. There are some words of human rights. It was a debate about human rights. And I forget, what is the quote? Words do matter, and some of us did not forget, not here, not now, but we will not forget. I forget the other.
Right, he says philosophy can't make up these new words.
Right.
He says we're losing, we're ruining words like human rights, we're ruining words like racism by draining them of their meaning and politicizing them, and we can't make up new ones. So we've got to keep the truth.
So this is a man who didn't do things without thinking. Obviously.
No, everything.
So when he was using very fiery rhetoric that was going to ruffle some tail feathers, he knew that words mattered, and he was choosing his words for that purpose.
Very carefully, yes.
Yeah, so you use the term the undiplomatic, I wrote it down, undiplomatic diplomat.
Right.
Would he have liked being called an undiplomatic diplomat?
At that particular moment in the United Nations, absolutely.
Because that's what it called for at the time.
Absolutely. It was the Third World Dictators Debating Society. Who coined that phrase, Gil? You did. Oh, good for you.
And I call him a diplomatic warrior, because he understood that diplomacy had to change, because he'd written this article for Commentary magazine called The U.S. in Opposition, saying we've got to realize that the UN is no longer the UN of the 1940s. It's changed, and we're losing the majority, and we have to use different tactics in order to stand up for our principles, otherwise we'll lose our souls.
You also wrote or quoted someone, and I'm sorry, I'm not sure which it is. I have a note to myself, being a magnet for controversy came at a price. And right now we're talking about this with the benefit of hindsight and being able to put it in a context where this is a courageous moment. But it wasn't smooth sailing at the time. And talk about the price that came.
Well, the price, first of all, was just...
we know, obviously losing the job initially.
Right, he ultimately loses the job, but it's more than that. It's, first of all, he was really seared by the Moynihan Report controversy in 1965. So he goes into the UN wounded. He also had been somewhat traumatized by his support for Nixon in 1972. He was a Democrat who had worked in the Kennedy administration, worked in the Johnson administration, then went into the Nixon White House. And when Nixon turns out to be as corrupt as he was, Moynihan feels like maybe he stood up for the wrong guy. And he says, what is a Moynihan? Is a Moynihan someone lacking in ideals? Is he a whore, a fool? And so he wants to do right. He wants to do the right thing. And it's scary. We forget, because we make these guys into superheroes. It's scary to get up in front of the UN knowing that your boss is undermining you, knowing that most of your colleagues are talking behind your back, and do it. And he does it. So it's that, and then there's also the he's not sure where the American people are going to be with him.
It's tough enough to figure out our own motivations, let alone someone else's. But what do you think motivated your father? I think your mother said it wasn't power.
No, it was ideas, principles, and ideas and policy over politics. Though he was a master politician, and many people underestimated his gift for political rhetoric and for getting elected. You know, he got elected 4 times in the United States Senate by the largest margin of victory,
easy thing to do,
especially in New York State. But he very much had the interests of the people of New York and the people of the United States first and foremost, more than political consultants or high rolling donors. And I think people knew that about him. And I think that came through at the UN moment with the letters of support he received from all over the world and the country, was that he was standing up for truth.
And now we say in this town that we yearn for days of bipartisanship, but straddling both parties and being involved in administrations of both Republicans and Democrats didn't make him popular with everyone.
No, certainly not. I mean, it's interesting, he remained a liberal. Even when he was in the Nixon White House, he was the House liberal. And he got a lot of pushback. Certainly, in the 1960s, you can imagine being a Harvard professor and Kennedy and Johnson, veteran working for Nixon,
sure.
didn't make him very popular. In fact, you had to leave your house one day when there were.
What happened?
Oh, well, the SDS said that they were going to come burn our house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and so we had to evacuate. Fortunately, nothing did happen, but I remember Dad saying at the time when President Nixon asked him to join his cabinet as special advisor on urban affairs, the cities were in flames, there were riots and so forth, and he said, "The President of the United States asked me for my help. What should you do as a good American? You should go."
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you mentioned already that this was setting the seeds for Ronald Reagan's run for president, and he quoted this speech a lot during his run against Gerald Ford.
Right. I mean, one of the extraordinary things is November 1975 is such a rich moment. At the beginning of November, Gerald Ford basically tells New York City you can go bankrupt, and there's that famous Daily News headline, "Ford to City, drop dead." And Reagan, in November 1975, announces his run as a Republican for the nomination against Gerald Ford, who's a Republican, and that creates a major duel. And during that run, Reagan repeatedly quotes Moynihan's speech and gets tremendous applause. And so that's, in a sense, a passing of the torch. And of course, when Moynihan is in the Senate and Reagan's president, they'll clash over issues, especially over domestic policies, but there's also a certain respect and a certain understanding. These are among the two individuals on the face of the planet who see that the Soviet Union can collapse and will collapse. Pope John Paul and Margaret Thatcher are in that very small club, and people look at them all as nuts. Right? And it's important to remember, they think they're zany, and they were right.
Nuts, tomorrow's geniuses, right? What, besides Irish descent, what did Ronald Reagan and Pat Moynihan have in, Daniel Patrick Moynihan have in common?
I don't know that they
Their politics weren't
not at all. And one
cases.
was from New York, one was from California. I think they were very different people temperamentally and so forth. But they did share this one view about the Soviet Union, that is for sure. And Dad kept a paper trail. I remember he gave the 1984 commencement address at NYU, and it was called "We Should Wait the Soviets Out." He said their system is collapsing, their bankrupt ethnicity will make this multi-ethnic state fall apart, the totalitarian doctrine is spent. And you could hear a pin drop, but he was proven right. And at the time, again, people thought he was crazy. But then Henry Kissinger sent Dad a letter of apology saying, "I stand corrected, your crystal ball was better than mine." Because Henry was saying, "Oh no, the Soviets are going to overtake our economy and so forth, and we need a weapons buildup," which was, in fact, Dad felt bankrupted our economy and was not necessary.
Since we sit in the Wilson Center, we shouldn't allow observe that he was called the greatest scholar statesman since Woodrow Wilson, and he's one of the founding fathers of the Woodrow Wilson Center. In the very brief time we have remaining, about 20 seconds for each of you, I'm going to ask you first, Gil, beyond even this story that you write about, what is the lasting legacy of Daniel Patrick Moynihan?
That he wasn't a soothsayer, but he was a scholar statesman, and he understood that social science can help us understand politics, and that's why he appeared prescient, because he was thoughtful, did his homework, and looked ahead.
And Maura, sort of the same question for you, but also any personal insight that you would offer as far as what is it that we don't know about the private man that's important about the public man and who he was?
Well, he was a man of great loyalty, and he was a very devoted friend. He truly cared about other people. He also cared about the underdog. You know, he cared as much about single mothers and the poor as he did about the bigger issues like the state of Israel, and he never stopped trying to do his best.
Well, thanks to both of you for joining us today. Gil, congratulations on the book, Moynihan's Moment, a terrific read. And really, it's been a pleasure. And
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed it.
Of course.
When we return, a Wilson Center fellow provides insight into the latest round of saber rattling from North Korea right after this.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
Welcome back to Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Hazel Smith is currently an Asia Program Fellow at the Wilson Center. She's also a professor of humanitarianism and security at Cranfield University in the UK. Her areas of expertise include North Korea, and that's what we're going to be speaking about today. Hazel, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, I'm guessing you did, as I did before we came on the set, looked at the latest headlines, and we see now stories about North Korea moving missiles to the coast, or a missile to the coast. The rhetoric is heated. Here's something from the last 24 hours from North Korea's state news agency. The moment of explosion is approaching fast. No one can say a war will break out in Korea or not, and whether it will break out today or tomorrow. The responsibility for this grave situation entirely rests with the U.S. administration and military warmongers keen to encroach upon the DPRK's sovereignty. How seriously do you take this saber rattling?
I think we have to understand that the news agency will exaggerate the views of the government, but on the other hand, there's always something there. And the germ of this is the same as what the discussion that's taking place in South Korea and the United States at the moment. There has been escalation, I think, on both sides, and both sides blame each other for it. And both sides are probably nearer to hot conflict in the sense that there are no diplomatic mechanisms left if, for instance, a maritime dispute spills over or a land dispute spills over, such that it's not that either side wants to see a start in war directly, but that wars sometimes happen or conflict sometimes happens by accident. If that happens, both North Korea knows and South Korea and the United States that these things could escalate beyond anybody's control, and so it is a serious issue.
What is the catalyst for this latest round of escalation? Is it sanctions? Is it military maneuvers by South Korea and the U.S.? What is North Korea reacting to?
North Korea takes the long view. It's not a democracy, so it doesn't have a 4-8-year term approach to this. Since the end of the Cold War, what it's tried desperately to do is to have some way in which it could feel, whether for better or worse, this is its views, safe as a regime, that it wasn't going to be invaded, that there weren't going to be attempts to overturn the political leadership. It's tried to do that from its own perspective through negotiations. As you know, there were some rather successful negotiations with the Bill Clinton administrations towards the end of the administration, and then again with the George Bush administration. From its perspective, the North Koreans think that the United States administrations, even if they put forward a nuclear plan in which both sides can agree somewhat, that the United States won't be able to get things through Congress. That's their view. And in the last few years, what's happened is that increasingly internally, North Korea's military have taken control of the political process. It's wrong to think of North Korea being run by a single person anymore, particularly since Kim Jong-il died. It's run by a military collective. Kim Jong-il should be thought, Kim Jong-un, the current leader, should be seen more of a front for the military leadership. Not entirely a figurehead, because he carries the weight of his father and grandfather behind him, but certainly doesn't have the power that his father and grandfather had. So there's a symbiotic relationship there, but certainly it's military policies that are in control domestically and in terms of foreign policies. When it comes to a crisis, the military as an institution, as militaries everywhere, follows military-leaning policies. Unlike democracies, there are no checks and balances. In this country, for instance, the military has its say, but there are checks and balances within the democracy. And that doesn't take place in North Korea, and so political problems result in military-based solutions, i.e. the creation of what they call their nuclear deterrence.
And who's the primary audience for this heated rhetoric? Is it the United States and its allies in South Korea, or is it an internal audience? Is this an attempt to consolidate power within by raising the specter of an enemy from the outside?
Well, there are different messages to both audiences. In the past, what North Korea has found is that when North Korea has come close to hot conflict as opposed to cold wars of words between itself and the United States. That's pushed the United States and North Korea together into diplomacy. Might not be good. I'm not making a case for this, if it's good or bad, but that's happened. And so there is some part of the North Korean rhetoric and moves which are trying to get, paradoxically it might seem for a North Korean audience, trying to get some movement in the diplomatic process so that there can be some discussion about the things that concern North Korea from their perspective, and presumably that means that they want to talk about what concerns the United States as well. Part of that. There is also what's happening for a domestic audience is not so much the fact that the North Korean government is making statements which are designed to uphold its legitimacy, but it's actually making organisational steps inside the country to prepare North Koreans for war, mainly organising young people, but also organising the communities up and down the country. Now, it regularly does what it calls these civil defence activities throughout the country, but these have been stepped up. And in my view, this means, and I think the people of North Korea think this as well, that unlike the normal rhetoric, the North Korean government does fear, and I say fear, that it may be going towards war. And the last time this happened was in 1994, when the Clinton administration, before they moved to an agreement, and North Korea entered into a very, very tense period when the war room in the White House was being mobilized. And some of your audience will remember that this was only saved by former President Jimmy Carter going and negotiating directly with Kim Il-sung. I think this is the nearest in nearly 20 years that we've got to a very dangerous situation. Many people always say that the situation on the Korean Peninsula is dangerous, but this really is different from everything that I've known since 1994.
So quite serious. Well, I want to thank you for taking this time to give us a brief overview and an update. And we'll see what happens, and perhaps we can have you back for a longer discussion when there's more to talk about. But thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
In addition to thanking Hazel, I also want to thank Gil Troy and Maura Moynihan for joining us earlier in the program, and tell you that that's all for this edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.